Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to react to the fiction finalists for the National Book Award for Fiction 2023. The announcement was made for what the finalists are earlier today, and I haven't been able to film anything until right now because of work, and also, of all days, they decided to do construction on the street right outside my house. So for most of the morning, there was just loud noises of trucks and bulldozers and, that beep, beep, beep sound. So it was awful. But they're finally gone. I finally have a moment. So I'm going to talk about the fiction finalists. Again, only the fiction. I'm not going to react to the other categories, which are nonfiction, poetry, young people's literature, and translated literature. If you are interested in what made those lists, I will link the National Book Awards website down below. You can feel free to jump over there and check it out. I will also note before we get started that I am not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about what each book individually is about among the finalists. If you are interested in more information about that, I am going to link my video about the long list down below. I reacted to all of the titles there. And because I like to use long lists as tools of discovery, I went through each book. Some of them I was familiar with, some of them I wasn't, but I went through each book to talk about what it is about in depth. And it was a fun process. So if you want that information, check out the long list reaction, which will be in the description box down below, along with some other fun things that you can check out. Really quickly, let's begin by running through the 5 books that made it onto the list of finalists for fiction for 2023. And then we will talk about one other thing, then we'll talk about finalists individually and what I think might have a chance at winning. And then we'll circle at the end to talk about the books that did not make it onto the list from the long list, because there were 2 books from the long list that I was particularly excited about that did not make it onto the finalists. And I know at least one of those is something that a lot of other people were really excited about as well. So we'll circle around to that at the end. But first, let's run through the titles really quickly. First is Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's Chain Gang All-Stars. Then we have Aaliyah Bilal's Temple Folk. Then we have Paul Harding and This Other Eden, followed by Hanna Pylväinen's The End of Drum Time. And finally, Justin Torres' book, Blackouts. Those are the books that made it onto the list of finalists. Again, we will talk about each one by one in a moment. Before we do, I didn't talk about snubs when I did my long list reaction. And a big reason for that is that the National Book Award has a long-standing history of being very quirky. It marches to the beat of its own drum. That is one of the things that I find most interesting about it as a book prize. It's very difficult to predict, which makes it fun to follow. So snubs are a difficult thing to call with this prize. They are very off the wall, difficult to predict, and that makes it hard to say what is going to be a snub. They also really like to discover new authors and voices and share them with people. They love to be a tool for discovery, and for that reason, it's not always surprising when established author does not make the list, but they usually have a pretty good blend of established authors and new voices that you would like to learn about. The thing that is notable that I hadn't talked about in that video is that Jessamine Ward had won National Book Awards for Fiction for her 2 previous novels. And Let Us Descend, her novel that is releasing later in October, was not on the long list. So I felt like I would just give a moment to that right now. I have an advanced copy, so this is not the actual cover of the book. But this will be released later in October, and this sort of ends her chances for a 3-peat. Because of the timing, I do have a bit of question about whether or not this is eligible for this year, but I believe it would have been. So this did not make the list, but she had previously won for her 2 previous novels, Salvage the Bones and Sing Unburied Sing, one of which I included in my list of the 25 best books of the last 25 years. I'll link that video down below if you have not checked it out, both of which are really amazing. So this feels like it ends her chances for a 3-peat, and for that reason, it just felt notable, and I felt like mentioning that here in this video, just for what it's worth, because I don't think this would be eligible for next year. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below, please, because I would rather be correct about these things. But as far as I know, it would have been eligible for this year. Let's talk quickly about the finalists, the books that made it onto the list, and we'll kind of go through. So I'm going to start with the blurb that the National Book Foundation has on its website, because they kind of run through a sentence for each book, and then we'll look at them individually. What they say is, Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's dystopian novel Chain Gang All-Stars simulates a private, for-profit prison system where prisoners compete for freedom in live broadcast gladiator-inspired death matches. Aaliyah Bilal's debut short story collection, Templefolk, examines the diversity of the Black Muslim experience in America. Paul Harding's novel, This Other Eden, traces the legacy of a mixed-race fishing community living on a secluded island off the coast of Maine from 1792 to the early 20th century. In Hanna Pylväinen's The End of Drum Time, a Lutheran minister's daughter falls in love with a native Sami reindeer herder and joins the herders on their annual migration to the sea in 1850s Scandinavia. Justin Torres' Blackouts considers the multi-generational gaps in personal and collective queer histories through the real-life inspiration of Sex Variants, a study of homosexual patterns. That's what they say about each of the finalists. Let's dive in a little bit deeper on each individually, starting with Chain Gang All-Stars. This is probably the most known book that was on the long list, and therefore the most known book on the short list, although This Other Eden is trailing pretty close behind. I still think it's safe to say, even with This Other Eden being on the short list for the Booker Prize, Chain Gang All-Stars still feels like the most known book on the short list, probably the most best-selling book on the short list, but it is also the most surprising inclusion on both the long list and the short list, because the National Book Foundation is really good at diversity. Let's start there, actually. When people talk about the difficulty of recognizing diverse voices in book prizes, I always look to the National Book Foundation as an example of a prize that is very good at doing exactly that. So it makes it difficult for people to say, well, a book prize really has a difficult time recognizing diversity, because the National Book Award does it pretty much every year. This list of finalists is very diverse. It represents a lot of different types of stories, varieties of stories and experience, and that is what the National Book Award does. And it's another reason I really enjoy following this prize. Every year, they have at least one title on the long list that comes from a genre that is not typically recognized by major book prizes, be it science fiction. There was a paranormal-ish book once. They've had some books that flirt with mystery conventions in the past. Usually that book does not make it onto the short list. However, it does typically make it onto the long list, or one of them does. And this year, that book is Chain Gang All-Stars, which has now made it onto the short list. And when you look at what this book is about, it actually makes sense. Because although this is a book that is very action-adventure, although this is a book that flirts with sci-fi conventions, the fact that it is a pretty scathing indictment of for-profit prison systems, and the fact that it pretty heavily deals with race, really makes it something that is in the wheelhouse of the National Book Award. And that is why, even though it's surprising that Chain Gang All-Stars was recognized, once you think about it, it actually really makes sense. So I think there's a really good chance Chain Gang All-Stars could actually win, although it's tricky because the National Book Award loves to be quirky and unpredictable. So there's actually a really good chance that any one of these 5 books could win. But I feel like Chain Gang All-Stars is in a very good position heading into the final announcement. And we'll have to see what happens, which is obviously the case anyway, because we have to wait about over a month, actually, for the announcement to take place. But this is a book that a lot of people have liked. This is a book that a lot of people were really excited to see make it onto the long list, based on the reaction on my video, at least, and in other chatter that I've heard online and in the world as well. There was a smaller percentage of people who sort of scoffed at the inclusion of Chain Gang All-Stars on the long list as something that shouldn't be taken seriously from a literary perspective, but that was a very much smaller percentage. A lot more people had really enjoyed Chain Gang All-Stars and were very excited to see it recognized, because usually for a book like this, you don't expect to see it recognized by a major literary prize. And that's pretty exciting. So we'll see what happens. I think it has a really good shot at winning. I think people might be surprised if it does, because of the subject matter, the genre of this, and how sort of unexpected it would be. But this really does fit in with the profile of the National Book Award, so I'm not at all surprised. And this is also something that I would like to read at some point. I'm not rushing to do it, but it is something that I would be interested in reading at some point. Again, not feeling like I'm in a rush to do it, but it is something that I'm very interested in based on the premise itself and what I've heard about this book. It is a bit of a familiar premise if you've heard of like Marathon Man or The Hunger Games or anything like that. But I think the framing of the for-profit prison system makes it stand out for a lot of people. Although it feels familiar, this does feel like a book that has its own identity as well. So that is Chain Gang All-Stars. Then there are two books that I have read on the long list and now on the short list of the National Book Award. And both of them are going to be next. We're going to start with Temple Folk by Aaliyah Bilal. One of the things that really attracted me to this book in the first place are the blurbs on the back of the book. You have a blurb from Edwin P. Jones, who is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Known World. Disha Philyaw, who is the author of My Beloved, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which was, I can't remember if it was shortlisted for the National Book Award, but I believe it was definitely longlisted. I just don't remember if it made it onto the shortlist. Angela Flournoy, who wrote The Turner House, which is a book that I really like. Marlon James, who won a Booker for The Brief History of Seven Killings. And Emily Rabateau, who I am unfamiliar with. But that is a really hardcore group of blurbs on the back of a book. I actually read this because, full disclosure, Aaliyah Bilal reached out to me and said that she would love it if I would read her book in exchange for a fair review. And I said yes. And that is how this got here. That is also why, again, full disclosure, I have a signed copy of this book. I was really happy to read it. It was something I was already interested in, and I did like it. So I will link my monthly wrap-up where I talk about this. If you'd like more on my opinions of this book, that will be in the description box down below. But I think what's really great about this book is that these are stories you really don't see, not just in literature, but you don't really see stories about Black Muslim people in film or on television either. And when you do, what you see is usually an incredibly stereotypical vision of these stories. And what you get in these short stories is essentially a really beautiful panorama of all the different types of experience you can have as someone even just tangentially connected to this community. Because there are people who are hardcore believers in this book. There are people who are not, or who have lost their faith, and who are only tangentially connected to the temple folk of the title. But it is a really great book with a wide range of experiences, and I think that is quite worth experiencing. Aaliyah Bilal is also a beautiful writer. I was actually reminded of Jhumpa Lahiri, and really, honestly, I can give no higher praise than that. The prose in this book is very elegant. It is very precise. Sometimes it feels a little bit too elegant and precise, but the fact that this is a debut is rather astonishing, and it reminded me of that sort of elegant and precise and beautiful writing that you would find in Jhumpa Lahiri's collections, most notably Interpretive Maladies. I don't think this is at the level of Interpretive Maladies, but keep in mind, Interpretive Maladies is one of my favorite books of all time, and is one of my favorite short story collections, as you can gather from that. I also included it in my 25 best books of the last 25 years, which, again, will be down below. So the fact that I'm even putting this in the same league as Jhumpa Lahiri and Interpretive Maladies really says a lot about this book. And this was a book that had a very quiet release when it was published. And this is one of the things that the National Book Award is really good at. It's good at recognizing a very good, high-quality book that had been largely overlooked. and sort of telling other readers or people in the literary community, this is something that's worth your attention. So I'm very hopeful that the fact that this made the long list and the fact that it is now on the short list will get more people to this book, because I think it is a journey that is worth taking. I think it definitely has a chance at winning because, again, this is the type of story that the National Book Award really loves and loves to recognize. Aaliyah Bilal is the type of author that they would love to lift up and get people to pay attention to, which is clearly what they have already done by placing her on the long list and now on the short list. But a win would really secure that sort of legacy for her, because National Book Award winner is a title that will follow her much more strictly than National Book Award finalist, which she already has a claim at. So we'll see what happens with that. I would give Chain Gang All-Stars maybe a bit of an edge over this one, but I won't be surprised if Aaliyah Bilal pulls off a victory here. Then we have the other one that I read, which is This Other Eden. Now, I've talked a lot on this channel about book prizes and how typically if one book prize gets its fingerprints on a particular book, other book prizes might be a little wary of getting their own fingerprints on it. So it's been broken this year by the Women's Prize, because Demon Copperhead had already won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction when it also won the Women's Prize for fiction this year. Typically, especially the major like elite level book awards, like to recognize their own book. The National Book Award is the one that I would say is most likely to throw that out the window. They don't really care if another book prize has its fingerprints on it. So This Other Eden is on the Booker Prize shortlist at the moment. Paul Harding has already won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction in the past for Tinkers. That's actually what drew me to this book. I wanted to read Tinkers for a while, so this was sort of my excuse to do it, especially if he does ultimately become the first person to have won a Pulitzer Prize and a Booker Prize. There's still a chance because he is a finalist. We'll find out. But there is precedent for this with the National Book Award. I'm going to pull up my dates for the Booker Prize and the National Book Award. But the reason I'm so excited is that the precedent setter for this was Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart, which was a finalist for both the Booker Prize and the National Book Award at the same time. And that was in 2020, so it was the pandemic year. So Douglas Stewart didn't really have a conflict for attending both events, even though I believe they were announced on back-to-back days. So he was able to attend both ceremonies because they were virtual. But ultimately, Shuggie Bain won the Booker Prize and not the National Book Award. But there is precedent. So this year, the Booker Prize will be announced on November 26th, and the National Book Award will be announced on November 15th. So the National Book Award will come first. I don't know how much the National Book Award is on the radar of the Booker Prize, but it does feel like the Booker might not care too much if this were to win the National Book Award. I think there are some other books that the Booker would be a little more likely to gravitate toward anyway on their list. So I don't think this is going to be a year where we're going to be getting the same book winning the National Book Award and the Booker Prize back to back. However, it is thrilling to think that it might happen. I respected this book more than I loved it, which is the same as how I felt about Tinkers by Paul Harding. But I think the messaging of this book is beautiful. The story that it tells is hard to hear because it's awful. Like, terrible things happen to the people in this book. But it is an important story. It is based on a true story, which makes it all the more harrowing in many ways. But I wouldn't be surprised to see it recognized by both. Again, I might give a bit of an edge to Chain Gang All-Stars, but there's definitely room for This Other Eden to emerge victorious. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. The next one on the list is Hanna Pylvänen's The End of Drum Time. This feels the most different from all of the other books because it has that Scandinavian setting and that historical setting. But again, the National Book Award is really good at representing a diversity of stories, so it's not that much of an outlier. I think if this was a book that won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, there would be a bit of cognitive dissonance because the Pulitzer is much more strict about its mandate, about adhering to American life and that sort of representation of it. So when a book like The Orphan Master's Son wins a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, it feels much more of a surprise because that's a book that's set in Korea. However, the National Book Award has recognized books that were not very inherently about American life before. So this is a book that some people have commented on and have really been interested in since I did my long list reaction. It sounds like a really interesting book. It's one that I would be interested in potentially reading, but I'm not rushing out to do it. I think I would be much more likely to read Chain Gang All-Stars first. If this ends up winning, I might consider bumping it up on my list of books to read. But until then, until we know for sure if it will, it's something I'm interested in, but it's kind of low down on my list of things to get to. Certainly not before the end of the year. But it does sound like a really good book. I have heard some good feedback on it as well. I think, again, I might give Chain Gang All-Stars the edge over this one. I might even give Temple Folk or this other Eden an edge over The End of Drum Time. But again, the National Book Award loves to be surprising, so keep that in mind. Anything could happen at all. The final one on the list of finalists is Justin Torres's book, Blackouts. Now, this is the book that has gotten the most mixed feedback of any of the books that were on the long list, at least on my reaction video and in some reviews that I've seen popping up on, say, Instagram since the long list was announced. So this seems to be a bit of a cilantro book, and I think a lot of that comes down to the really tricky structure of this book and what it is doing. I think a lot depends on how you respond to the way this is put together. And again, the way they describe it is Justin Torres's Blackouts considers the multi-generational gaps in personal and collective queer histories through the real-life inspiration of sex variance, a study of homosexual patterns. So this is not your typical novel. It is structured very uniquely and differently. The format is different from any other book on this list, certainly. And I think how you respond to this book depends on how much you like experimental literature or literature that gets outside of the typical structure that you might see. If that's not something that you are interested in, this is probably not the book for you. The fact that this made it onto the long list shows that the jury for this year's National Book Award was clearly in the camp where they responded positively to it. And the fact that it is on the short list now also means that they are among the people who responded positively to that form of structure. I think this actually has pretty good odds because, again, the National Book Award loves to recognize lesser known people. And Justin Torres has written a book that people enjoyed previously, but is still relatively unknown in the literary world. And this is a book that has a very complex structure. They've done that before. William Vollmann won a National Book Award for a book that really had a tricky structure, according to a lot of people. I haven't read that book. But this feels like something that they could really enjoy. Interior Chinatown was a book about the Asian American experience in this country that was written in the form of a screenplay. So the National Book Award likes things a little bit quirky. So for that reason, I'm actually thinking that I would give Blackouts the edge for the win. But again, anything could happen. Anything could happen. I'd be really interested in hearing what you think will win, if you have any opinion on the matter, in the comment section down below. But I think if you told me I had to predict right now, I think I might predict Blackouts. Because again, the fact that it made it onto the long list and that it's now on the short list seems to indicate that the jury for this year's prize is in the camp where they would really respond to this book. Any book could win, but I'm going to give Blackouts a slight edge in my own opinion. Now let's quickly talk about the long list before we say goodbye for the day, because there were some really interesting books on that list. So the books we say goodbye to from the long list are Ponyboy by Eliot Duncan, Loot by Tania James, Night Watch by Jayne and Phillips, A Council of Dolls by Mona Susan Power, Holler Child Stories by Latoya Watkins. So Ponyboy was a book that really particularly sounded interesting to me. A lot of the feedback says that it is devastating. And for that reason, I'm kind of wondering if it might be a book for me to read right now, but I am still interested in reading it. That is something that I requested my library get a copy of. And I have not gotten a response since the long list was announced, so I don't know if they will get a copy of it or not, but I'm kind of hoping that they will, because I would be curious to read that book still at some point. Loot is a book that sounded a little quirky, and I wasn't quite sure. The feedback that I got from it didn't convince me that it was something that I needed to run out and read. Not all that surprised that it didn't make it onto the shortlist, but it still sounded like a really interesting book. Night Watch is another book that I am interested in reading. It's a new release by Jayne and Phillips, who wrote Lark and Termite, which is another book I've heard a lot of really good things about. I'm not in a hurry. I would probably read Chain Gang All-Stars before I would read this. I would probably read Blackouts or Ponyboy before I would read Night Watch, but it's definitely a book that I'm really interested in getting to at some point. A Council of Dolls is the book that or one of the two books that didn't make it onto the shortlist that I was really interested in reading. It is available on Scribd, and I'm hoping that I will get to it soon. It sounds a little bit quirky, a little bit odd, but I'm really interested in reading it. And I know there was a lot of excitement for that book on my long list reaction in particular. A lot of people heard about it, thought it sounded fascinating. So I hope a lot of people have read it. If you have, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. That is still a book that I would really like to get to. And I haven't, because my reading has been very slow lately. And we don't have to get into why. But it's still something that I would really like to read. And the same goes for Holler Child. That is something that I also requested at my library. A Council of Dolls I didn't, because it's on Scribd. But Holler Child is another book that I requested at my library. And they have not responded to that request either. Hopefully they will get it. I would really like to read Holler Child. It sounds like a very interesting book, and it comes from a publishing imprint that I find fascinating, which is Tiny Rep Books. Tiny Rep stands for Tiny Reparations. It is a publishing imprint that seeks to celebrate and amplify diverse voices. So I love that imprint, and I think Holler Child sounds really interesting. So it's sad that we lost Council of Dolls and Holler Child, but I honestly don't know what I would have swapped out in place of them, especially since I haven't read them, so I can't officially say or have any opinion on this matter. But I would love to hear what you think of this shortlist, what you think might win, what you miss from the long list, and if you think anything at all about Jesmyn Ward not appearing here. Let me know all of that in the comment section down below. I'll leave it at that. We will find out who wins on November 15th. Until then, the Nobel Prize should be announcing a literature laureate this week, so stay tuned for that. And of course, the Booker Prize will be coming later in November as well. Lots of exciting book award stuff coming. But in the meantime, I appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.